Hello and welcome to Syria Talks, the unique show exploring the intricacies of the Syria crisis. I'm your host, Danny Mackey. US policy in Syria has been dealt a major blow as the main rebel groups receiving support, training and arms from Washington, Al-Hazm movement, has been almost decimated by weeks of infighting with the Syrian branch of Al-Qaeda, whilst many of the vetted rebels, touted by Obama to become a future national army of Syria, have defected to the hardline jihadists. According to FSA sources, Nusra Front is striving to eradicate all branches of the FSA in northern Syria as a stepping stone to expanding their influence and declaring an Islamic emirate similar to that established by ISIS in the northeast of the country. Al-Nusra Front controls large segments of northwestern Idlib, having routed most forces deemed moderate by the Western countries. The dissolution of the Hazm movement, which was the most favoured and best-known rebel group, raises tough questions about Washington's strategy and strong limits over Obama's future options. This, augmented with the rise of ISIS, further complicates the Syria conflict, triggering a major predicament for the US's much maligned foreign policy. Today we discussed what impact this will have on Syria. To get more perspective on the matter, Ruben Rosiers, spokesman for the European Solidarity Front for Syria, joins us from Belgium.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Ruben. But before we begin, let's take a quick look at this video report on the latest regarding the chaotic rebel infighting.
US policy in Syria has taken a significant step back as rebel groups described as moderate have defected to ISIS and Al-Nusra Front in the chaotic north of the country. It is a blow for Obama, who had wanted to raise an army of rebel forces consisting of 5,000 militants to fight ISIS and the Syrian government forces. The United States had initially launched a training program aimed at preparing Syrian moderate rebels to combat militant fighters of the Islamic State through ground operations and increased military support from Washington. The U.S. Secretary of Defense, Ash Carter, said on Wednesday that the American administration is not sure about its legal authority to provide protection to the trained Syrian rebels from attacks by local military forces affiliated with Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. The Hazm movement, the US-backed group in Syria, was almost completely obliterated by Syria's power Al-Qaeda branch Al-Nusra Front, with US-made weapons taken by the radical group as spoils of war. Analysts have provided a bleak assessment of the situation, with former US Ambassador to Syria, Robert Ford, stating in Foreign Policy magazine that US President Barack Obama's administration should undertake a major diplomatic and assistance effort, or it should walk away from Syria. Ford also described how assistance to moderate Syrian fighters has been small and erratic, and the rebel fighters have been badly divided by foreign states, parceling out desperately needed aid among multiple groups. Even The Guardian discussed how the Hazm movement had been seen as the poster boy of the moderate opposition Washington hopes can be trained to oust President Bashar al-Assad, adding that the US Syria policy is in tatters after favoured moderate rebels disband. The importance of this event reflects the changing dimensions and dynamics on the ground, with more rebels on the ground becoming radicalized and joining Al-Qaeda or ISIS. Whilst the strategy of Washington's to build a force of about 16,000 moderate rebels to oppose the Islamic State militants in Syria now seems highly unlikely. Ironically, the pictures of Al-Qaeda fighters, who the US had sought to crush, wielding US-made weapons, makes hard viewing for Washington. Moreover, ISIS was welcomed by the opposition at the start of the crisis and was praised for its prowess on the battlefield. They acted as shock troops for the insurgency up until mid-2013. Much of northern Syria is in the hands of the extremists, and the United States is left with no palatable ally in the area in the midst of a regional conflict that continues to spiral out of control.
Hi Ruben, thanks for joining us. Ruben, how does the defeat of Al-Hazm movement change US foreign policy in Syria?
Well, it will partly change it, but let's get that for the US problem at this moment, that their weapons are in the hands of Al-Qaeda. Why? Let's take a look, for example, after what happened to the Hazm movement in the west of Aleppo, that some weeks after that, or even shorter after that, that the TOW weapons were used against the Syrian army in Aleppo, Latakia, and probably also in other places. So as long as the Syrian army gets attacked by al-Nusra or other groups, the Americans are happy. The US is happy because they, of course, still want.
But Ruben, most units in Syria are now Islamist. But even the Islamist groups have been infighting. I mean, we have Al-Qaeda, ISIS. There's this whole kind of schism of this interfighting in between the Islamists. Does it not show that radical Islamism is a fragmented ideology?
True, but the US is now preparing new troops in Turkey, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and I just think that they will take more time now and that they will let the Nusra Front fight against the Syrian army to weaken both, and then at the end it will be easier for them. I also see, and a few days ago this got clear, that the European Parliament, being of course a puppet of the American policy, that the European Parliament called...
But surely we could argue that European policy is different to US policy. I mean, we could argue when the United States wanted to strike Syria, it was the European countries which said no, we shouldn't be attacking Syria. So we could argue European foreign policy in regards to Syria and in regards to the Middle East has been different and on a different independent pathway to US policy. Wouldn't you think so?
Yes and no, because for example, we all know that there are thousands, probably 10,000s of fighters who left Europe to go fighting in both Iraq and Syria. And we all know that the European intelligence, that they did nothing to stop them. There are people here in Belgium who even came home after that they went fighting in Syria and Iraq, and they got even jobs from the government. And there was a big trial here against a group called Sharia for Belgium, who now has dozens of fighters in Iraq and Syria. And the trial, it was really a joke. They didn't get any punishment at all.
Regarding this subject, I mean, we have now these young European jihadists. There are around 20,000 foreign fighters in Syria in total, especially these young Belgian jihadists. And we understand Belgium has a very sensitive issue with jihadism and the people from Belgium going to fight in Syria. I mean, what threat do these jihadists who are originally from Belgium pose when they return to their homeland?
It's a huge threat. It's a huge threat because even now, and the Belgian state security, they admitted it, that they don't have the ability to follow them all, that they actually don't know what is happening, that they need more people and more money to follow everyone who is actually crossing the borders here and what everybody is doing. As you know, we live in Europe, we don't have borders anymore, so actually our intelligence doesn't really know what's happening. And also the political correctness here also, and this is what I meant in my other comments, they are actually fueling the anti-Syrian policy because they just let it happen. Belgium, for example, was one of the first countries to break every diplomatical contact with the Syrian government. They allowed people to come on television and to say that they were collecting money for the jihad in Syria. They are not doing it as openly as America, of course, but when you look at all these facts, you cannot say that the European countries are doing anything to stop young jihadists for taking the plane here to Turkey and to cross the border. Another thing that I wanted to add is that this week the European Parliament accepted a motion that calls up to arm everyone who is fighting Daesh. Also, they are now calling up to arm, for example, the Kurdish forces, who are, as we could see in Hasakeh, they are also, and as we could see in Aleppo, that many of them are actually working together with radical groups. We can see that in Aleppo, where actually the key of the siege on the eastern Aleppo is in the Kurdish area. We can see that, for example, al-Nusra is not attacking the Western-backed Kurdish forces, at any moment we saw infighting between Western-backed Kurdish forces in Hasakeh with the Syrian army. We see now that, and we see this very clearly in Europe, in the European Parliament, that the West is even now playing a quite nasty card by even buying some Christians. They are buying some Christian militias to arm them, to make them work together with Kurdish separatist forces just to break Syria into pieces. So at the end, they are still playing their game. And we can see in Europe that till now, nothing has changed. They are, as we said, of course, not as radical as Saudi Arabia or the US.
Does the destruction of these moderate brigades signify the end of Western backing for these militants?
No, not at all, I'm afraid. We have to see, again, what is the goal of several Western countries, of the Gulf states, of the Zionist state, and of the US is still double. On one hand,
how much has this served the government of Bashar al-Assad?
It doesn't. It does in theory on several issues. You could see, for example, some small gains on the diplomatical field, but at the end, it doesn't matter for Syria's president if the weapons of the US are being used by so-called moderates or by al-Nusra, because they are being fired at the same Syrian people.
But one second, the accusation from Western countries is that the Syrian president has used the tool of extremism so he can further his political position in Syria. And in essence, this is what's happening, isn't it? We have all of the brigades on the ground are turning into radical Islamists, and the Syrian president is in a stronger position. Has the Syrian president used the tool of extremism to further his political position?
Not at all, because I am still waiting after 4 years of war for the images or the talks of the so-called secular and moderate opposition. You can call somebody what you want, but that doesn't change him. You can call an apple and banana and vice versa, but it will not change anything. We could clearly see till now that there was not one example of an area that was occupied by so-called rebel groups where life went on as normal. There was not one area where we could see that there was a stable situation. We could see one area in Syria occupied by forces not loyal to the Syrian president.
Ruben, what do you think Washington makes of its patrons in Syria, its group, the group which it has actually helped and aided to become the most infamous rebel groups? What do you think it makes of it being destroyed? I mean, is this the start of a new policy for the US? What will they do?
I think they will take more time. I think they will just take more time. Of course, it was not what they hoped for. They hoped that things would go faster. They hoped that the Syrian people would not be loyal to their country. They hoped that everything would go fast, that it would be a matter of maybe in the beginning weeks or months or maybe a few years. But we're seeing now that the Syrian conflict is almost entering its 5th year. So, of course, this was not what they hoped for. I'm not saying that. But on the other hand, for them, their end goal being the ousting of Syria's president and Syria's ruling party is still on the table. And they have time. They are really relaxed. Of course, they made some PR mistakes, that's true. But at the end, we all know that they're not afraid of that. They destroyed Libya, they destroyed Afghanistan, they destroyed Iraq more than one time. And we all know that they will not turn their hand. If they would really care about Syria, then they would, of course, change their policy, but they just care about their interests.
Is al-Nusra becoming the new ISIS?
Well, actually, we are now seeing, in the beginning we saw that there were some things that they had in common. But as we could see in the Western media, when ISIS was beheading civilians or captured fighters, we could see it everywhere in the media. with Al-Nusra, ironically, this didn't happen. We still have to wait for the first media campaign of the US against Al-Nusra. And for this, I would say no, because actually a few days ago, there was a rumor that Qatar was asking the Al-Nusra Front to cut its ties with the central command of Al-Qaeda to become a new so-called moderate force. So they would even buy Al-Nusra to become the new moderate force. And of course, we know that Nusra is now getting stronger in the shadow of ISIS. We see this clearly. And what is my fear, really, that they will actually use Al-Nusra now as a weapon against Syrian government, now to weaken the Syrian government.
If we could just have a different perspective on this. Anas Jarbour here joining us, political analyst joining us here today. Anas, you have these young jihadist individuals who are going over from the UK, from other countries, to Syria to engage in activities which most people would consider terrorism. I mean, how do you think this will influence UK policy and Western policy in general towards this?
Well, if we go back now a few years ago, with the incidents of Syria, and if we go back to the TV and journalist interviews with the President Assad, when he mentioned something, he said, if the Western countries, they don't stop their policies funding all of these extremisms and radicalism coming over to Syria, because at the beginning they were helping and with the logistic aids, so with money and different kind of aids to these fundamentalists, and also to the FSA, which most of the FSA moved into the Al-Nusra fronts becomes. So then Al-Nusra fronts become ISIS or Daesh. Now, President Assad said, if the Western countries don't stop this, then there is going to be an earthquake at the area. Now, then the Western countries, they translated this as, President Assad was threatening the Western countries. Then after 2 years, we saw the incidents of France, we saw lots of incidents in the West, and
But this is precisely, I mean, we have governments who have actually accused the Syrian president of instigating this.
Yes, they did accuse the Syrian president, but then they managed to translate this after 2 years. At the beginning, they did accuse the Syrian president, and after 2 years, they said, the Syrian president was completely right. We should have listened to what he said instead of accusing him.
So would you call this a shortcoming of Western policy or an element of incompetence on the side of the Syrians? As in the eyes of the West, it remains the Syrians and especially the government of Assad who has actually helped to perpetuate this element of terrorism which is going around Europe at this current moment in time. I mean, he was described by John Kerry not so long ago as being a magnet for terrorism. I mean, where do you stand on this?
Syria has been a magnet for terrorism because we have not to forget all of the push of the money and the funding from the Gulf countries such as Qatar or Saudi Arabia, moving into Syria to become in these terrorism's hands. And these radicals have been advertising for coming over to jihad in Syria and get all of this money. All of these young kids, I would say, or teenagers, they traveled from the West countries to Syria because they thinking A, about jihad, B, about money. Even though, and you'll be surprised, lots of these fundamentalists who went from the Western countries to Syria, they've been given the ideas of go and fight in Palestine. And they landed them in Turkey and they brought them into Syria. They thought this is Palestine.
But they would argue that they're young British or Western Muslims, and they're arguing that they're seeing innocent people being killed, they're seeing all sorts of atrocities and acts of terror, and in response to what they're seeing, they're actually going out and fighting in defense of humanity. What would you say to that?
They think they are going to defend humanity. That's what they think, these young kids. But the unfortunate thing, they've been brainwashed. That's what they think. That was someone implement these ideas into their mind. It started from the countries where they traveled from, and then they went into the Middle East. Because not only in Syria, we can see today it's in Syria, it's in Iraq, even knocking the doors on Lebanon as well, and we saw it like a few months ago. That's what they think. They think they're going to support civilians, and once they land on the Syrian land, and they're facing the facts, and that they cannot run away, because if they do run away, they're going to be captured and beheaded or get burned.
If I could just take this to Ruben very quickly. Ruben, I would like to ask you, if you were a Western government and you had the issue of jihadists, returning jihadists to deal with, what would your policy be?
Well, first let me answer that we are not only talking about innocent kids who think that they want to help people. As I told you before, in Belgium we had a big group, and they were actually the center of all the jihadists going to Iraq and Syria, a group called Sharia for Belgium. So that's not really a name for a group of innocent kids. So actually, I want to arrange this on a human level. On a human level, it's very clear that people who join Al-Nusra or ISIS, that they go to Syria not to help the population.
Okay, then who is to blame?
Our government is to blame, because they didn't do anything to stop them. They, for example, this group, Sharia for Belgium, they were known for years. The Belgian government now actually admits that they had a list of all the jihadists who were with Sharia for Belgium, and they didn't use the list, and now 95% of their people are in Syria and Iraq.
But if they were to act, they would surely be accused of alienizing and ostracizing a Muslim population. Do you not see how this works both ways?
No, because those people, they were already on television several times. They actually were on television giving interviews and explaining why they hate democracy in Belgium. So there was no chance for this. Actually, there are many cases of radical groups here in Belgium. There was a imam whose son died in Idlib, and he came on television, Belgian television, and he said, "I am proud of my son that he died fighting the Kafir regime of President Assad, and I will go to Syria and take his place." And actually he did. So actually even a man who can announce on national television that he wants to go fighting jihad in Syria, they didn't stop him.
Anas, what do you say to that?
I would say to stop all of these movements, and if I'm a Western government arguing this, I would have to start to stop all of these movements from every single holy place at the countries. So not only mosques, it will be, we have to stop every single radicalism, not only in the Islamic religion. We've got the Islamic and the Christians and the Jews, so many religions. We've got to stop every single radical movement, and aim for us to stop them kids when they become over 18 or 19 years old. So they don't have this radically thinking and this mind, which they don't become fundamentalists, and they want just to travel for jihad, for killing. What's jihad today? Jihad today is killing, which is everyone against. It's against the human nature. We're not here to kill. We're here to give messages, to teach. So for me, to stop all of this, we've got to start from schools. We've got to start from getting to the mosque and see what they're teaching these kids in mosques. What they're giving them, what kind of books, why they've been brainwashed. Now, if we see these guys who traveled from the UK to Syria to fight in Syria under the name of jihad, but then they go to kill civilians, obviously. If we see that what they've been taught. Today, if we look at the street, we see them 6 and 7 and 8 years kids. They've been brainwashed, completely brainwashed, in the aim of go for jihad, go for jihad. No, all of these places should be turned into better teaching places, better schools. Not
So
teaching
you're
them
arguing the
radical
issue is
movements.
education and the issue is a culture of upbringing. But at the same time, we've had a phenomenon now where we've had the Syria crisis has been continuing for up to 5 years and there is no real solution.
It's so easy.
How
the
would you
solution for
actually
this.
prevent these jihadists going? Is there any real legislation or
yes.
act which can be implemented to fully stop them going?
Oh yes, it's so easy. If you drive in a car, once you stop feeding it with the petrol, the car will stop. As easy as that, okay? And Syrian Republic ambassador at the UN Council, he mentioned it and he said it so many times to all of the Western alliance, when he said, once the money stop coming into these extremisms and the fundamentalists such as ISA and Nasr Front and so many of them now today in Syria, once the money stopped, we have to grant it for you that the Arab Syrian army can finish all of these movements within 3 months and finish this crisis. But just you have to stop funding.
That is something said by a government official. I mean, most
Yes.
Western officials
And
would doubt the credibility of
as a
that.
civilian myself, I can see it as well in my eye. Once all of the Western countries who supported the terrorist movements against the Syrian civilians, once they stop funding, all of this will stop.
But funding is not necessarily a major actor or a player
Once they stop funding, that means there's no arms.
Because we are discussing now
hands.
movements which are self-funded. We're discussing movements who have consolidated themselves. These are movements and groups who are individually funded. There is no external funder who is giving them finance or weapons. Like the groups such as ISIS, it makes its own money. So it's hard to see whether if you would stop such funding, the whole crisis would be secured in a few months or weeks.
5 years ago, before the incident and the conflict started or this world war on Syria, I would call it, before they started, there was lots of ideas of stop the Islamophobia in Europe. Stop this Islamophobia in Europe. No one was listening to us at all.
Perhaps this is an issue we could pick up on a bit later on. So stay with us for the time
Now
being.
we've got a march on Saturday, 22nd, 21st.
Now,
About the Islamophobia. After what? It's too late now.
Okay, Anna, stay with us, keep the thought, and we'll continue with this a bit later. Moving on now. The northeast of Syria has seen heavy clashes between government forces and ISIS militants in the neighborhoods of Al-Sana and Al-Hawaiqa in the city of Deir ez-Zor, and in Hawajat Saqr, an area on the outskirts of Deir ez-Zor city, which has witnessed tough clashes, with Syria troops locked in a life-or-death struggle for the northeast of Syria against ISIS. Whilst in Daraa province, clashes have been taking place all week as the Syrian army offensive has hit a lull. Aided by Hezbollah commandos and Syrian regular soldiers, have been fighting Islamist battalions in the area for control of the strategically important countryside. Rebel strongholds were also targeted in the Hamidiyya village in the western part of Quneitra, which resulted in an increase of violent clashes. Casualties were reported on both sides. Both Al-Quneitra and Damascus provinces have joint borders with neighbouring Lebanon and Jordan, which have been among the main spots of infiltration of foreign fighters into Syria, and these areas remain under rebel control. This comes as unidentified gunmen attacked ISIS militants in eastern Syrian town of Al-Mayadin in Deir ez-Zor, killing more than 12, the latest in a series of guerrilla attacks on the ultra-hardline jihadist group in areas it controls near the Iraqi border. The attacks in Deir ez-Zor province were carried out by two separate groups of gunmen, the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights reported. IS, which has seized nearly all of Deir ez-Zor province last year, has faced a wave of hit-and-run attacks by unidentified gunmen in the surrounding area, whilst the battle for Handarat and Bashkoy in northern Aleppo has not produced the kind of results the rebel forces expected. Syrian forces still retained a significant presence. The Syrian Al-Qaeda group Jabhat al-Nusra, in cooperation with Jaysh al-Mujahideen and Harakat Harar al-Sham, part of the Islamic Front, were unable to achieve any progress in the village of Handarat on Wednesday. due to the heavy bombardment from the Syrian Air Force and the heavy resistance encountered by the irregular forces of the National Defense. According to a military source within Aleppo, both sides suffered significant casualties at the village of Handarat, as their positions leave them susceptible to Syrian strikes from the air. Let's have a different perspective on this. Anas, let's go to you straight away. There has been intense clashes in numerous areas of Syria, but especially in Deir ez-Zor, where you have this struggle between ISIS militants and the Syrian army. Could you describe to us what the battle in Deir ez-Zor is like?
Well, we can see the strong movements of the Arab Syrian army today against these ISIS, on cooperation as well with the Iraqi army, because basically they both fighting. They're fighting the same monster, so they have to cope together. Now, the movements of the Arab Syrian army today against ISIS, we can see lots of movements, and they're going further to manage to capture and control most of Deir ez-Zor. Now we can see the pull out of ISIS of the area, and it's just been announced 2 days ago that the Arab Syrian army managed to get back the biggest oil field in that region. So from here we can notice straight away that the Arab
How important
Syrian
is targeting the oil? Because the oil is a major source of funding for ISIS militants. If the oil is targeted, will it actually help to degrade and defeat ISIS as Obama wants?
It will, because who's buying the oil from ISIS? Well, America. From one hand,
you blame America.
I'm blaming the companies, the factories, we can't really say all of America, but then we can blame the policy, the American policy, because on one hand they're buying the oil from ISIS, and on the other they're saying we are fighting ISIS. As well, on the other side they're saying, oh, we're not backing ISIS. So it's two faces policy. Now, once the Syrian Arab army...
But the United States would argue that they're actually attacking ISIS. They have formed an international coalition made up of over 30 countries and are striking ISIS militants and ISIS targets on a regular basis. I mean, do you see the fact that the US is actually a major part in defeating ISIS rather than a country which is aiding ISIS?
We can see the US movements of defeating ISIS is like a game. But we can see the US movements of funding ISIS and supporting ISIS is like a real game with them, as they're buying the oil of ISIS. Who's buying the oil of ISIS? How can ISIS sell the oil without the permission of the Americans?
Let's get Ruben's ideas on this.
For them to get the arms.
If we could just get your perspective on this. How important is the oil supply to ISIS?
I think indeed it's essential, and it was a very, very good thing that the West, or the Western public opinion, should ask itself, first of all, indeed, who is buying the oil from ISIS, and secondly, how do they get it transported? I'm still waiting for the first Western country to finally start blaming Turkey for this, and Jordan and other countries, because look, even if you have oil in the middle of the desert in Deir ez-Zor, how do you get the oil out of there, and to who do you sell it? I'm still waiting. If the Americans would really be serious, they would be sending their troops to the Turkish border, to the Jordan border, to the Israeli border. They would stop every drop of oil that would be stolen from the Syrian or from the Iraqi lands to be sold to fund their jihad of ISIS. Did you see anything? No. The only thing we saw were Patriot rockets to so-called defend Turkey against the Syrian army.
The finger is pointed at Turkey when it comes to the oil being sold by ISIS. I mean, if it does make its way to Europe, and we understand there is an oil embargo currently on ISIS and on oil coming from Syria, but if it does go through Turkey, to which European states does it actually go or end up in the end?
I don't think it really goes to states officially, but don't forget that there is always the black market. It doesn't have to be sold to Sweden or to Germany officially. It can be sold on the black market. We all know that Turkey also needs oil. Many other countries also need oil. I don't think it's being sold to Europe. But as we saw, for example, also when half of the industrial zone of Aleppo was being stolen, it was also transported to Turkey and sold there on the black market. There are many things that we cannot see from here, but we do know that there is a reason why the Turkish army is not doing anything to stop it. They have the possibility. Their army is strong enough. They are the second biggest NATO force. It's very easy for them to ask support from the other NATO countries, and this would be so easy. I can't imagine that the entire NATO would have any problem to secure the Turkish border. It would be a matter of days.
Okay, Ruben Rossi is there, spokesman for the European Solidarity Front for Syria. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you, bro.
Anas, if we could just take this to you. The issue of Turkey, ISIS, the chain of logistical support which come through, how important is Turkey to the fight against ISIS, and to what extent has Turkey been mired in aiding ISIS?
Well, how important that if Turkey to fight ISIS, unfortunately today is not in the Turkish hand. All of these movements is not in the Turkish hand, I would say. Who is controlling Turkey today is NATO, whatever the NATO will say, or the big father, or the Americans, whatever they will say to Turkey, Turkey will have to show the loyalty to them and just do whatever they've been asked, which not Turkey, I would say Erdogan's government. As we know, Erdogan's government has been funding ISIS logistically, and I'm one of the people who went to Syria, went to different parts in Syria, and just as a humanitarian and peace missioner, went to there to just see what's happening and what's going on. So I went to this area, which is Kasab, right on the border. It's
yeah, I mean, I know you visited the city, the town of
yes.
Kasab, which was on the Turkish border. I mean, what did you find there? How was the reaction from the people who live there?
Yes, the reaction from the people who left there, it was indescribable. We can't describe it at all, because it's another massacre. We all remember the massacres of the 1915 that the Ottomans did against the Armenians. Basically, Kasab, just to bring it up to mention, Kasab is majorly Armenians. So when ISIS and the radicals went into Kasab again, who went to open the way for them, for these groups? It was the Turkish army who went inside Kasab first. They logistic all of this area for the radicalist groups, such as Al-Nusra, such as ISIL, and then ISIS went in. Now it's something really impressive, and it's something really will disappoint you when you are walking in the street in Kasab and you'll see a Turkish ambulance car.
You saw a Turkish
Kasab.
car?
Yes, it's right in Kasab. It's been targeted by the Syrian army. So what's this Turkish ambulance car right in the middle of the Kasab doing? Or a police car? What is it doing right in Kasab as well? Right in the middle of Kasab. But then the shocking thing was, yes, if it's an ambulance, yes, we might say this ambulance car was evacuating injured people, but then it was not. Because basically, we didn't search for this. It was just right there in the street. I went there to teach sport, and then all what we saw, this car was in the street and full of bullets. So an ambulance car was full of bullets. We walk down the street as well. You see lots of logistics aids, food, coats, lots of things being left behind from the radicales group they were fighting in Kasab against the civilians and the Arab Syrian army. After they left and they ran away, and the Syrian army managed to bring Kasab back, we see all of this logistics aid. It all came from different countries. You can see it's made in Saudi Arabia, made in Germany, such as the medicines. You can see a Turkish ambulance car. So from here we can
But
realize
surely,
the
but surely
Western
these
hands
countries
and the
are
Gulf
entitled
hands.
to arm as many rebels as they want.
Sorry, pardon me?
But surely these states are entitled to arm rebel movements, rebel groups as they want, because this is a war and this is geopolitical. States have interests, and it's surely in the Turkish interest to help support the rebels, isn't it?
Well, it is a war, but it's against the humanity. It's against the humanity. It's against the civilians. What are you going to say when I couldn't show my face to one of the parents when I said to him, I came from the UK. He said to me, oh, the UK. That was his answer straight away. One of the Armenian parents. He said to me, oh, the UK who funded ISIS to beheaded my son. And he said to me, that's where my son is buried now.
God, that's shocking.
Yes.
Well, if we could just get a different perspective on this. Also joining us is Haya Al-Atasi, a political activist joining us from Beirut. Haya, thanks for being on the show.
You're welcome.
Aleppo has recently flared up in a new upsurge of violence. What does this mean for the UN plan to freeze fighting in Aleppo?
Well, to start with, there are so many doubts around this plan, actually, because before we want to talk of any ceasefire, there needs to be a mutual hurting stalemate. And apparently, we did not reach this point yet. Both of the sides seem to be continuing with their fighting. None seems to be really convinced that the fighting should stop. As such, we need to find some or to start working on confidence building measures, because apparently neither the opposition forces nor the Assad forces trust each other. So I don't think.
Do you think this particular issue of the lack of trust between all sides, is it an obstacle to a true political solution?
Of course, because you cannot have any political solution unless there is trust. Unless the opposition trusts that Assad is willing to do something or Assad is willing to stop, they will not stop. And there's a huge lack of trust between the two sides of the opposition, unfortunately. So I don't think we will reach any political resolution like that.
We have seen government-backed national reconciliation plans implemented in Damascus. Some have worked and others have not worked. Why do you think that is?
First of all, as I previously mentioned, there's no trust. Second of all, not all opposition groups are really that much optimistic about ceasefires because, to be honest, first of all, the regime is not serious. Even if there are ceasefires, there will still be shelling, there will still be some skirmishes here and there. And second of all, if the regime enters any of the areas, the civilians will be really badly treated. So the civilians are stuck, between this point of either they're going to die through shelling of the regime, or they're going to die by being either detained or badly treated by the regime.
Okay, hey, if we were, for example, to take the city of Damascus as an example, you have places such as Qudsiya, Berzeh. These areas have witnessed national reconciliation, and fair enough, it has been forced upon some of the civilian populations living there, but the end solution is better. You have a process where food is entered into these towns, and there is an element of assistance in terms of medicines, water, etc. However, other places in Damascus, such as Jobar and towards the eastern Ghouta area, it would be impossible to have a solution or a national reconciliation process. I mean, how do we actually breach this political divide? How do we make areas within Syria make their own local ceasefires?
I think it depends on the strength of the opposition forces. So when you're talking of Eastern Ghouta, it's about Jaish al-Islam and Zahran al-Aloush, and now Zahran al-Aloush trying to shell Damascus, So I think it mainly depends on the strength.
How much does that work against his cause?
Against Zahran al-Aloush's cause?
Yeah.
Him shelling Damascus?
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's really meaningless him doing that, because the more he's shelling Damascus, the more Assad is shelling Douma and the other cities in Eastern Ghouta, and more civilians are dying. So apparently it's actually pointless what he's trying to do. The problem is that these forces are now reaching a point where they are not fighting for the freedom of Syrian people anymore. It's more about warlords and trying to prove themselves are the ones that are in control.
If we could just take this to Anas. Anas, how do you see a political solution working out?
Mentioned so many times as there is no solution apart from political. Also, is got to be the Arab Syrian army. They have to keep the movements against these terrorisms, because these fundamentalists, when they are beheading people, how can we treat them? They're not allowing any peace solution to be brought down to be brought up to the table, by the way. So how will you move with this kind of groups? As A. B, when I was hearing now about the Zahran al-Lush or his groups and Jaish al-Islam or al-Islam army or al-Nusra, because they're just all ones, they're preventing all of the aid to come into the Al-Ghouta. However, when the reconciliation is happening, the national reconciliation is happening, such as in, for example, in Beit Sahim. Beit Sahim broke the reconciliation 4 times, the agreements as well. And during my last visit to Syria, I've witnessed lots of breaking down of reconciliation.
But some critics would say that this is the government's fault. It's the Syrian army's fault, because they prevent the entrance of aid into these areas, and that they have a siege essentially on some of the bigger areas of Damascus, and they do this to weaken the rebels militarily. I mean,
the Arab Syrian army send messages to the civilians, such as like in Douma, to evacuate Douma. If they want to have the aids, they have to evacuate Douma. The Arab Syrian army cannot really give aids to. There's no way that you give the aid to Zahran al-Lush or to his groups or to the FSA, because they're all terrorists. We don't give aid to terrorists.
Thank you, Anas. Haya, if we could just get your opinion on this. I mean, the entrance of aid, it's not the Syrian government's fault. Where do you stand on this?
The Syrian government is the one that's blocking humanitarian aid, whether to Douma, Eastern Ghouta, or to Yarmouk. The last aid that entered Yarmouk is in December 2014, where you have 18,000 people there under siege. How come the Syrian government is asking people to evacuate their houses, to evacuate their villages? And if they do not do that, it will block their aid? I mean, is it possible to empty a city from its people? This is actually absurd.
I mean, Yarmouk is an issue which we're going to deal with in the section which we'll deal with lastly. However, just one question. I mean, will the opposition ever actually agree to a negotiated settlement if President Assad remains in power?
First of all, when unfortunately the Syrian revolution has reached a point where there are so many players. It's no longer a Syrian party versus Syrian party. Personally, I think, although I am anti-Assad, but I think the opposition now is really very dispersed. It's not united anymore. The opposition does not really have a say to what's happening on the ground. So even if the opposition agrees to negotiate with Assad, we cannot guarantee that the fighters on the ground will actually agree to this compromise. But personally, I think that in order for you to have a solution in Syria, you will have to negotiate. Sooner or later, you will have to. Whether it's negotiation on a transitional period or it's a negotiation on Assad to leave. But actually, to be honest, it's not clear yet whether Assad will be leaving, or because, you know, after the Geneva 1 convention and then the Geneva 2, and none of either of them has been applied yet. So it's very blurry at this point.
Okay, Anas, I mean, speaking sense here, a negotiated settlement, this is essentially what would help perpetuate the position of all sides in Syria. I mean, how can President Assad, as a man, as a leader, as a statesman, who is almost accused on a daily basis of different forms and types of war crimes, how can President Assad rehabilitate himself? How can he change the way the Western media and the Western governments perceive him? Is this possible?
It is really possible. He doesn't need to change the way. He doesn't need to change their way. They will change their way. The time will tell. As you said, when he firstly said one of the statements, they started to accuse him, and after 2 years they realized what he said, it was a true statement, and he was giving them warning of, look, the terrorism is right on your doorstep. Be careful. And they didn't react to that. After 2 years, they saw these terrorism right inside their houses.
Okay.
It's coming out from their houses. Then they said, yes, his statement was completely true and we should have took it on board. Today, he doesn't need to say to the Western media or to the Western airlines who are forming this war against Syrian civilians. He doesn't need to prove anything anymore.
Okay.
Actually,
Point taken.
the movements
If we
on the
could just go
ground,
to
Syria
Hala.
is aiding
Haya,
every single
what is the
civilian.
humanitarian situation in the northeast of Syria? I mean, places like Hasakah, they're on the front lines. What is life like in those areas, especially in Hasakah and Qamishli?
Danny, the thing is that, especially in these areas, all the concentration is on ISIS and on the fightings that are going between either ISIS versus the FSA or other opposition forces, or ISIS versus what they call the regime that's fighting ISIS. You have two types of the humanitarian situation. There is either affected by the ISIS presence or by the regime presence, where there's no electricity, there's no water, there's barely any aid. I mean, we barely hear of organizations working in these areas. It's actually really difficult to access them because of the presence of ISIS and because of the presence of the regime.
Okay, if you'd just like to stay with us whilst we move on to the next section. A new report from the United Nations and a global coalition of aid agencies have accused international powers of failing the victims of the Syria conflict. Stefan Juraric, a spokesman for the UN chief, told the BBC, powerful nations have put their own interests ahead of the need to end the war in Syria. He was responding to a joint report from a humanitarian agencies which criticised the UN Security Council. It said civilians have experienced the worst year since the conflict began. More than 11.6 million people are now in urgent need of clean water, and nearly 10 million people do not have enough to eat. In December 2013, UNICEF declared that there were 4.3 million children in need of humanitarian assistance inside Syria. By December 2014, this number had risen to 5.6 million. More than 212,000 people are still living in besieged locations, including 163,500 in eastern Ghouta, whilst reports of at least 76,000 people killed in 2014 makes it the deadliest year in the conflict. If we could just have Haya on this. We've had this number of 76,000 people killed. Is this the worst year in the Syria conflict?
We cannot say it's the worst year because we do not know if the next years will be even worse and worse. As you know, as everyone is following up, this Syrian conflict is getting worse and worse every year. The number of casualties is increasing. People used to die under torture in detention. Next they are dying due to shelling, and now they are dying due to starvation. We don't know how Assad will be creative in his ways of killing the Syrian people. So yes, it reached the peak. Even the UNHCR High Commissioner has previously said that the Syrian conflict is the worst conflict that has ever passed. You know, the number of, I mean, more than half of the Syrian people are between refugees and IDPs, internally displaced people. What can be worse than that?
Okay. Haya Al-Atasi there, Syrian political activist. Thank you so much for being on the show.
You're welcome.
Anas, let's have your perspective on this particular subject. I mean, we've had this horrific report which has come out by the UN. It accuses Syrian forces and it accuses rebel forces at the same time of some horrific atrocities. How bad has this year really been for Syria?
Comparing to the other 3 years in the past, it's been really bad. It's been the worst year. But then, if they don't approach a peace solution, we might have 2016 more bloodier year, really. According to the UN report now, it looks like the UN has started to change the way that they're doing their reports. At the beginning, they were saying the Syrian government been preventing the aid to get into the Syrian civilians, but now they're saying, oh, the rebels. Now they mention the rebels.
But do you not accept that some of this is essentially proven facts which have been shown to be right and correct on the ground, and there is no escape from this in terms of the Syrian government has committed some of these acts.
Which acts? Acts of
Besieging,
Syrian government preventing the aids?
starvation, etc.
Sorry?
Besieging, starvation, not allowing aid convoys to come in, shelling,
the
barrel
starvation.
bombs,
Yes,
etc.
the Syrian government did the starvation against the terrorists. They didn't do this against civilians. As I said, I was there in Damascus, and I've witnessed lots of movements. No, it's the opposite. It's the opposite, complete. Syrian government were putting flyers into the areas, such as for the civilians to evacuate and get into the safe areas, safe zones. As I said, the Syrian government cannot fund or they cannot give aid to the terrorists. Because let's say in one of the small little cities in Beit Sahim.
Okay,
which
if
is
you'd
a
just like to
suburb of
stay with
Damascus.
us for the time being, let's have another opinion on this. Eric Drazia, geopolitical analyst and founder of StopImperialism.org. Thank you for joining us, Eric. This new report has shed light on numerous different issues, and especially the humanitarian aspect of the war. Why has the Syria war and conflict been so violent?
Well, there's a number of reasons. I think that it would be difficult to run through all of them quickly, but I think that broadly speaking, the reason for the violence, the reason for the scale of the violence is the scale of the war that's being perpetrated against Syria. This is an international war. This is not a domestic civil war. You have many different regional actors. You have Turkey, you have Jordan, you have Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and others who have provided funding, who have provided the on-the-ground material support for the fighters, the terrorists, and the so-called rebels. And so the scale of the war, I think, to a large extent really dictates the level of violence, because you have terrorists who have embedded themselves in many communities. They've taken control of vast swaths of territory. The war itself really is an existential one that is being fought by the Syrian Arab army, by the Syrian state, the Syrian government. They understand full well that the operation is a regime change operation, and that their very lives, their very existence depend on it. And so the brutality, the scale of the violence, all of that is really dictated by the on-the-ground reality. And I think that
Now,
that's
Eric,
really
places
something
such
that is
as
completely
Al Yarmouk
ignored.
camp have been almost forgotten by the world. What is the situation like in such places where you have this continuous war around an area where you have civilians, and the situation is dire, isn't it?
Certainly the situation is dire, but again, I mean, the reality is that there is a war going on, and in a war there are, of course, always tragic consequences on all sides, civilians, and then, of course, those who are caught in the crossfire between the forces that are defending Syria and the forces that are attacking it. And so you have these refugee camps, you have these various aspects of the war that really deserve more attention, and they are ignored. That is absolutely true. But again, I think that the broad question that really needs to be asked is, why are there so many refugees? Why have so many had to flee? Why are there vast regions of Syria that have been taken over by forces that are not indigenous to Syria at all? These are the forces that are really causing many of the refugees. Now, certainly some of the refugees have an anti-Assad position, that is clear, and their anti-Assad position could be for any number of reasons, could be ethnic, could be political in nature. That is absolutely true. But the question of the refugees and the humanitarian convoys and all of that cannot be separated from the war itself. There is documented evidence of the so-called corridors and the convoys being used by Turkey,
Eric,
being used by other players for purposes of expanding the war, and that also should not be ignored.
Eric, according to the aid agencies, the world has abandoned Syria. Is this true? Is there an element of certainty to this?
Well, it depends on what the context of that is, what it means by abandoning Syria. If you mean to say that the world is not interested in the conflict in Syria, this is absolutely false. As I mentioned, many of the regional actors are actively involved in fomenting this war. There's ample documented evidence of Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, Jordan, and others being directly involved. Let us not forget Israel and the Israeli Mossad being directly involved. So certainly none of these players have forgotten about Syria, nor has Iran forgotten about Syria, nor has Hezbollah forgotten about Syria. So what they really mean in the context of that sort of a statement is that the Western public public, the Western
Now,
media,
Eric, these
has forgotten
agencies
about
have been
Syria.
involved in the Syria conflict for numerous years. How credible is this report, which has been sanctioned?
I'm sorry, you have to repeat the first part of your question.
These aid agencies who've been involved in the Syria crisis for up to 4 years now, this report which they have released, depicting the amount of casualties, the actual devastation on the ground, how credible is it? I mean, how credible are the agencies who are releasing this report?
Well, in some senses, they have some credibility. They've done some important work, but at the broader level, it's very difficult to trust many of these agencies, many of which are funded by precisely those same forces that are waging the war on Syria. And so when you look at United Nations institutions, or when you look at Doctors Without Borders, or when you look at any of the number of organizations that are operating on the ground, and you follow the money, you follow it right back to Wall Street, to Washington, to London, to the centers of the Western powers. And so it's difficult to really think of them as disinterested parties. And so certainly they provide their slant. They provide a decidedly anti-Assad, anti-resistance axis slant. But I don't think that it should be discounted entirely because, again, there are important pieces of information
how much
that come out of these
blame
reports.
do the Syrian authorities take in this regard?
How much what do they take?
How much blame do the Syrian authorities take in this regard, in regards to the issue of human rights violations?
Well, I think that certainly that there are certain cases that need to be examined closely, but I think that the Syrian authorities would say quite clearly and quite correctly that they are on the defensive and that they have been on the defensive since 2011. When you have a war being waged against your country, you cannot quibble about every little incident. You have to look at the broader picture. The military and strategic picture is a dire one for the Syrian authorities. They have lost significant parts of the territory that they are responsible for controlling. They are responsible to the whole of their population, not simply to one pocket or another, one ethnic group or another. They're responsible for the territorial integrity of the entire country.
Anas, if I could just ask you, there are areas in Syria which are besieged now. I mean, how can we stop starvation?
The Syrian army, they try to get the aid to these areas which they are under siege by negotiations with the locals in there. And so many cases that went approved and they become well successful. Just the fact of most of the civilians who went out of the area to get this aid when they went back to their cities or to the areas where they are from, all of this aid being taken of them from the fighters or the rebels who are controlling the areas. Now, the Syrian army, they're following different procedures now to prevent this starvation. Any report who says the Syrian army is starving people, this is untrue and it's unfact. The fact is, which I witnessed right in my eye when I saw most of the Syrian army stand in the street in lots of cities and providing aid.
Anas, thank you very much. Eric, if we could ask you finally just the same question. I mean, how can we stop this forced starvation in different areas of Syria?
Well, first and foremost, you have to cut off the flood of fighters that are still coming into Syria. You have to block the entry points. You have to allow the Syrian Arab Army to defend the borders of the country rather than trying to present the illusion of these humanitarian corridors and so forth. From there, you need to have international monitors, international agencies, which are coming from third parties that are not directly a part of this war, and they would need to be involved in bringing in aid. But again, it needs to be incorporated with the Syrian government. They cannot be cut out of the process.
Eric, thank you very much. A big thank you to all of my guests today. But before we leave you, just a reminder that Syria wasn't always in a state of war.
Despite the war, life continues in areas of Damascus as people adapt to the raging conflict. Workshops and exhibitions are held and civilians try to keep an element of normality in their lives. Studies show that life expectancy has been reduced due to the crisis, but we see an increase in social and cultural events which serve to bring people together and represent unity in a time of uncertainty. Syria's unique history is manifested in its landmarks. One of such note is the Hama water wheel, situated on the banks of the Orontes River. The ancient city of Hama is an important industrial and agricultural center that dates back to the early Iron Age. Although the city's economy had always depended on agriculture, evidence of when Hama water wheels or norias were first developed goes back only to the Byzantine era. Syria has always been a capital of culture and history in the Middle East, shown also by the splendor of the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus. The Grand Mosque of Damascus, known more commonly as the Umayyad Mosque, is one of the largest, oldest and most holiest mosques in Islam. Another famous Umayyad Mosque in Aleppo has, however, been damaged considerably by the war. The Great Umayyad Mosque in Aleppo is the largest and one of the oldest mosques in the Syrian city of Aleppo. It is located in the Al-Jaloum district, in the old neighborhood of Aleppo. The mosque was included on the list of World Heritage Sites in 1986 and gained fame throughout the Islamic world because of its embellishments in Islamic architecture and traditional buildings. Syrian officials have recently dedicated a trust fund for the redevelopment and restoration of such locations. With such beauty and rich history, it's no surprise that Syria has been described as the Pearl of the East.
For more updates, please visit levant.tv. Thanks for watching Syria Talks. Bye for now.